Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 70 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister.
And myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisive Law Reports.
Mark, last week you will recall we had a fascinating discussion with Liam Herrick, Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and we talked about the bill on hate speech legislation, hate crime, etc. Fascinating discussion.
Yeah, interesting. And we'll see how it goes from here on, because certainly the Oireachtas seems to be reviewing its previous support for it.
Well, Liam went into it in great detail and also talked about other matters, working for Michael D. Higgins, etc. No, really great interview. Really enjoyed that. Clio is the leading provider of cloud-based legal practice management software, providing lawyers with an easy-to-set-up, affordable solution to manage and grow your firm more effectively, more profitably, and with better client experiences. Start a free trial today. Visit clio.com/IE. Well, tonight we are delighted to be joined by Des Geraghty, trade unionist, politician, Shanno singer. What has that man not done? And in particular, we're going to talk to him about the Sinn Fein Funds case from the 1940s. A fascinating series of cases, I suppose you'd call it. And old De Valera got an old rap from the Supreme Court as well, didn't he, in the middle of everything?
It's an extraordinary case because it goes right into the history of the state, and the characters involved in the case are really interesting as well. It's a sort of an extraordinary confluence of events and people.
You know, Sinn Fein and holding loyal to the first Dáil, etc. And then the hero of the hour was Kingsmill Moore, Judge of the High Court.
Certainly.
Yes, absolutely. No, fascinating case, folks. Stay tuned for this. It's a fabulous interview. But first to three cases that you have identified from the Decisive website. The first case concerns a collision at sea between a trawler and a bulk carrier, which occurred off the southwest coast. You'd imagine, Mark, with all the water out there in the Atlantic, that they might have been able to get round each other. That doesn't appear to be the case. This is the case of MV Hurlingham versus MV Geraghty, I think it is. And it's Mr. Justice MacDonald, Dennis MacDonald.
Yes, so this is a case arising from a collision at sea between these two. And it sounds as if one was substantially larger than the other. One of them was a fishing trawler called the Geraghty, and the other one was a bulk carrier, the Hurlingham. And the question was, who was responsible for it? And I think, again, the best way of summarising it is looking at the words of Mr. Justice MacDonald. What he says here is, up to the point that the trawler made its foolhardy turn to the northwest without looking, the Hurlingham was not obliged to second-guess what the previously drifting trawler might do. In particular, it could not have predicted that the trawler would suddenly pick up speed and cross the ship's path with no thought for any approaching traffic. So he divided the responsibility as 85% for the trawler, Geraghty, and just 15% to the bulk carrier.
It sounds like a road accident out there on the public highway, Mark.
Exactly,
so there you go. Okay, so stay in your lane, ships. That's the way it is. Okay, second case today concerns a personal injuries action and an application for discovery of medical records in a case where liability for a road traffic accident had been conceded. The dispute centred on the extent of damages, particularly regarding the plaintiff's psychological and physical injuries.
Yeah, this is a peculiar one because on first looking at it, I couldn't quite understand why it has been refused, because these are the sort of records that are regularly sought in these sort of cases. The particular reason here, Mr. Justice Simons refused discovery of these medical records specifically because the defendant hadn't set up properly the basis for looking for them. And what had happened was the defendant had arranged for a medical examination of the plaintiff, and certain information was revealed during that medical examination. But this was not properly disclosed to the court. They didn't put forward a letter or a report from their own medical experts explaining why they wanted these further records from the plaintiff. And Mr. Justice Simons said, you can't just make a fishing expedition without explaining why you need to see the records. And the other thing that was of interest was that that they were looking for discovery in relation to certain incidents that had been pleaded, saying that they wanted more information. And he said, well, it's not a purpose of discovery to seek more information. That's a matter that should have been done by raising further particulars.
Yes.
So for both of those reasons, he refused them.
Okay, and I should say that was Pop versus and Forrestal, and as you said, a decision of Mr. Justice Simons in the High Court. Okay, finally today, a case that concerns an Isaac Wonder order. So I think regular listeners will have a handle on what that is. And this was against company directors who are deemed to be engaging in ongoing vexatious litigation. This is the case of Dublin City Council versus Coyle and another, and it's a decision of Mr. Justice Charles Meenan.
Yeah, this is a case where there was extensive. There had been extensive litigation, and in fact, it's all summarised in a schedule to the judgment. And an Isaac Wonder order, which is an order restraining further litigation, had been made in the High Court, and this was appealed to the Court of Appeal. And what again, a quotation sums it up very well. He said, "The appellants have made scurrilous or outrageous statements, as was found by the trial judge. The appellants made no attempt to inform either this court or the High Court that they would refrain from instituting further proceedings against the respondents." He goes on to say the appellants have a right of access to the court, but the respondents have a right not to be subjected to repeated, unmeritorious and costly litigation. So he upheld the Isaac Wonder orders.
Okay, very well explained, Mark. Back shortly with Des Geraghty.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
So it is my great pleasure to welcome to studio Des Geraghty. Des, trade unionist, politician, traditional Shanno singer, absolutely, biographer of Luke Kelly. I mean, how many things has one man done? It's incredible. And we're bringing you in here to talk about, as well as other things, the Sinn Fein Funds case, which kind of, dominated the legal world in Ireland in the 1940s. And we're going to do a fascinating case, separation of powers and Sinn Fein and all that sort of stuff. But we're going to start by going back. So Des, you're a Dubliner. So tell us, where does Des Geraghty come from?
Well, I was born in the Coombe Hospital, of course, in the Liberties, but we lived in number 3 Corn Market, which is at the top of the 40 steps, and anyone knows the old city would know it there. It's just beside St. Auden's Church. In fact, there are 2 St. Auden's, a big Catholic church, which is bigger than the small Protestant church, which is a lot older. But we lived right beside that, there, just beside the park, right in the heart of the Liberties, and great little community.
Okay, and
we loved it.
You grew up there, and you were always involved in is it fair to say republicanism? Did you come from a Republican family?
Yeah, I mean, our family was quite interesting in that they were very Republican, but there were divisions there. My mother had 3 brothers involved in the War of Independence at different stages, and one of them was with De Valera in Boland's Mill, and when the Civil War started, actually, they went in different directions, 3 different directions, curious enough. One of them, my mother's eldest brother, was an irredentist. He's involved in the Sinn Féin case later. An irredentist rejected his Free State completely. The other one went into the Free State Army because he was a supporter of Collins, and he followed Collins. And the other one took over. He was a leader of the unemployed in Dublin, who was in a plague on both your houses, and he was with Liam O'Flaherty taking over the Rotunda, and they put the red flag up during the prior to the Civil War, encouraging them all to concentrate in the poor of Dublin rather than the split.
So you had a tricolour in one hand
that was on my mother's
a red
side.
flag. And what about your father's side?
My father was in England. He had been in the Fianna Éireann, and his father whipped him off to Manchester with a job to keep him out of trouble in Dublin. And he was in Manchester at the time working. He had been in the Fianna Éireann. He was only 11 when 1916 came about, of course, and they told him to go home.
And you yourself, when did you get involved in politics?
I suppose I would say that in our home, the first religion was Larkinism. In other words, the hero to my parents was Jim Larkin. Yeah. And so that had an influence on all of us. And indeed, every one of our family, all my brothers, we all ended up in the trade union movement, we all ended up in the labour movement. So it was almost inevitable. There were many differences there, and indeed, I was in the Labour Party for a while, but I joined Sinn Féin in the 60s. Because of the Northern civil rights had developed, I found that people in the Labour Party were almost disinterested. People like Mick O'Leary and that were the new Labour Party people. But in fact, I believe that was the real way forward, and I supported the Republicans when I joined Sinn Féin at that time. But I had been in the Labour Party in the local branch in Crumlin. But prior to that, believe it or not, we were very young. We all supported Dr. Noel Brown, went out leafleting, and there was a very good reason for that, because I was in a school, in Francis Street School, and I remember in the first class I went to 3 kids in that school died of TB. And people were falling down like flies in the Liberties in those days. There was almost no understanding of how to even deal with TB. We were very lucky. My mother really looked after us and was very careful. And, but poor people suffered because the damn tenements, houses and so on. But the statistics actually show that was a real black spot even in Europe and with the Liberties.
And it's very interesting that you mentioned Noel Brown, because when we do get to talk about the Sinn Féin case, at one stage, the council that were representing the plaintiffs...
Hurlingham.
Yeah, well, wasn't it Sean McBride and John A. Coster who had to abandon the case because they went into the inter-party coalition government in 1948?
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, I mean, just anyway
but actually,
with Noel Brown.
Noel Brown was a hero to my parents and so on, because he was the man who did something about the whole TB question. He focused in on the problems of the health and so on. So we went out leafleting even as young kids. In fact, all my brothers and myself were actually leafleters for Noel Brown.
Okay. Can I go back to Sinn Féin in the 1960s? Yeah. Okay, so there was only one Sinn Féin in those days. Yeah. And the Republican movement led by Cathal Goulding, for example, at the time.
That's where the change came when he came back after being in prison in England. My brother Sean was involved in the 1956 border campaign.
Yes,
and he was in jail. Actually, he was escaped from Mountjoy. One of the few who did. He went.
Wasn't it a helicopter?
No, it wasn't a helicopter. That came later. He was taken to the Mater Hospital with an appendix, and he managed to weave his way out of there with his arm around a young woman, and the policeman didn't see them pass by. But so he had to go on the run. He went off. I was very, very young, and I didn't fully understand what was going on there in the 56. But he took off, and he was on the run for quite a long time. Involved in the border campaign for quite a bit. Then he headed off to England. And he didn't come back for many years. He was in London after that. It was interesting.
Okay. But you were saying Goulding was
Cathal Goulding took over in the IRA, actually. That's the reality. In about 62, he came back. And he had took a decision, which I think was a sensible decision, that the border campaigns and the gun was a disaster. It was going nowhere. They were not going to make any progress. So they had to develop a whole socialist policy based on land ownership, fishing rights, housing rights, civil liberties. So it was a complete move. People like Maureen de Bourke became involved in that time. It was a quite complete move into kind of civil disorder, as it were, but challenging all the social issues. And actually, in that way, bringing people from the Protestant community in the north, from trades council and so on, into the issues, on the civil rights issues. So that 60s was very exciting. I actually went up regularly. I walked in Derry, I walked in Armagh, and I walked in Newry on civil rights marches. And I experienced very locally some of the experiences from the RSC at the time, or the RUC at the time. We went up in the bus one time to Armagh, and we were directed into a gang of loyalists by the police. So they would get at us. So I became very much involved in that. Okay. So I never supported.
A split came, not to go over the top about it, but a split came in the Republican movement in 1970, wasn't it? And then there was, provisional Sinn Féin, provisional IRA, and then official.
Yeah, the thing was, the pressure came on the people in the north. There was no question about it, in the Catholic areas, and there was a rush to get guns. Cathal Goulding, in fairness to him, Thomas McGillen, said that would be a mistake. They should stick to the civil liberties, put the pressure on the British and on the Irish governments to deal with the issues. But they weren't able to control the elements, the Republican elements who wanted to get arms and guns and so on. And so what actually happened, there was a split around that issue with the campaign, as probably historically, the 30-year campaign started off. But there was still an element in Belfast and other areas who were loyal to the traditional Sinn Féin, the Workers' Party, who felt that was the wrong direction and we should continue to work with the trade unions and with the Protestant working class people in the north and in the south, incidentally, uniting people around social issues at the time. So that was the atmosphere.
And let's talk about your involvement with the trade union movement. As you said, Larkin was a hero in the House. When did you become a trade union official?
Well, I was working in RTE for a few years in the late 60s. In fact, when the first demonstrations developed in Derry, I was working in RTE. I became an official at the end of 1968. So it was around that kind of time. Michael Mullen saw fit to employ me. And I was asked, was I involved in the Housing Action Committee in Dublin? I said, I was. Yeah. I said, you're just the man we want in the union. So I had thought I'd written, I always wanted to work for the trade unions, incidentally. I had written and didn't really make any progress on that until that time. But I was delighted when I got his invitation to go to the Transport Union. But the great thing for me as well, my parents were both from City Key, from the docks. My mother's family worked on the docks. I was put into the number 1 branch in Dublin, which was the Dublin Docks branch, and came across all sorts of old friends that knew my family, knew our background. And I had 2 cousins there, Matty and Christy O'Neill, and they had been interned during the war. They were the sons of the man who was involved in the Sinn Fein case, Matty and Christy
Okay, well,
O'Neill.
we'll have to come to that, Mark. I know I'm banging on a little bit.
That's okay.
Look, just in terms of your career, I mean, obviously you went all the way and you became president of SIPTU. I mean, you were on the telly.
I had various posts.
Yeah.
In the organisation.
So just your progression to that.
Well, the thing was, I was in a branch for a number of years in the dockyards. I was very happy. I found I was in my home, and I was never going anywhere else, really. I felt that was the job I wanted to do on a daily basis. It was very, very stressful because we worked late nights most nights, and I was interested in music and politics, so you had to try and find time for music. So I had to give up the music most of the time because you couldn't be at music sessions and travel and at the same time doing the job.
Sure.
So I had to put my heart and soul into the job. But then we set up an education department in the union, and I volunteered to go there because I felt that my talents might be best used, not just as an industrial official, but I should get involved in trade union education, which I did. So I was a tutor. That took me all over the country, to every branch in the country where we were training shop stewards, where we were developing policies and strategies. And I was very interested in strategic trade union thinking. And this maybe came to the fore later. So I spent a number of years, and I became the communications officer during a major dispute, an oil dispute. It was a very big dispute, and I had to represent the union and all the media at the time, and they thought I did it well. So I became involved in the communications department of the union, eventually taking over the editorship of the Liberty magazine and the communications office. And in that area, I was involved in producing documents and policies and so on, and for national negotiations. And it's actually in there, that was the incubator, that area called the Development Services Division of the union, where we developed all this thinking about central bargaining, national bargaining, the social wage, trying to broaden, and the idea that man doesn't live on bread alone, but we need to get investment in education, housing, and so on.
Okay.
So that was my progression, but I stood for election when they came to
so
universal.
you're riding 2 horses. You were a trade union official, essentially, but you were also a politician.
I was, because I believed that, as Larkin believed, that there's 2 sides. So there's the industrial struggle and there's the political struggle, and both are important. I realised as a trade union official as well that just doing wage bargaining didn't affect the tax system. It didn't affect the cost of housing. Didn't affect the cost of education. In those days, like my own family, we had no money to go to university. People, ordinary working class people, couldn't do that, no matter how talented people were. So I felt that you had to progress on the political side as well as the industrial side. And for that reason, I was one of the architects of the idea of national bargaining, so that wage bargaining was only one element. We would get involved in discussing. People used to, if they got a pay rise, actually end up less off because they paid more tax and more social PRSI. And it was almost ridiculous. People came to me after being on strike and getting a big increase in wages. They go back and said, I'm worse off now than we used to be. Because actually we're put into the next tax bracket. And then the state was taking 58, 60%. Yeah, money was just gone. When people did overtime, they were paying more and more back to the state. So it was absolutely ludicrous in those days.
Can I just we're going to get into the case now, and that's kind of one of the reasons, because your backstory is also a reason why we wanted you to come in and talk to us. But in terms of politics, the role of an MEP, and it sounded like something that you really enjoyed, being a member of the European Parliament.
It was an education, and because I didn't see myself as a narrow nationalist, I was very interested in what was happening in Europe, in the development of Europe, and I was very much involved in developing ideas about the idea of a social Europe. In other words, not only in trade and economic, but in other words, building up a social status in Europe, which we benefited from enormously, in my opinion. And it was the big benefit to Ireland, was that we began to get standards, protection of workers, all sorts of new legislation, equal pay, all that came into the European... And in particular in relation to
the labour movement. I mean, the strides as a result of Europe have been colossal, haven't they?
Absolutely. No, I've no doubt about that. The standards of living that we enjoy now are attributable in large measure
Okay, so Des, as I said kind of at the start, we brought you in to talk about this Sinn Fein case.
Yes.
The Sinn Fein Funds case, which kind of ran from about 1942 till about 1947.
Well,
1950.
it became controversial because a piece of legislation was brought in 47.
47, of course, and then there was
My
the
Uncle
subsequent
Jim,
High Court, yes.
Seamus O'Neill was his name. You'll see him on the list there, was one of the people in Sinn Féin. They were very sore with Fianna Fáil and with De Valera after the war because his two sons had been interned with Martin Coyne, a whole lot of hundreds of people, by the way, who are not involved in the IRA were interned during that period. So they wanted to get their hands on the funds, which were the Sinn Féin funds. They were the executive of Sinn Féin at the time. And they went looking for this money. I think it was only something like £8,000 when it was in 1924, but it had grown. It was a lot of money.
Well, I saw a calculation that was done, and
Yeah,
these
what that would be
calculations.
worth.
Well, it said something just over £500,000.
Yeah, I'm sure it was really big
But I
money.
mean,
at the time.
you know, I often think, I mean, if you had £8,000 back in the good old days, how many houses could you have bought with that in the Dublin of the day? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But anyway.
So that was, they decided that they were entitled to this money. It was in a trust fund.
Because this had been put in the High Court in 1924.
The courts had took
and they went back in 42 to look for it.
Yes, and it was in a trust system, whatever the system, the legal system was in a trust under the jurisdiction of the courts. So they went looking for the money and they were pursuing it, Conlahan and people like that, very good legal advice and so on, that they were entitled to this money. Fianna Fáil and the government of the time were doing anything to stop them getting their hands on money or that money. So there was a big, it were very upset about the fact that this was progressing through the legal system. As you know, and there were appeals and challenges going through. And eventually the reaction in political circles was to run a piece of legislation in 47, which was to create a body that they would actually give the money to, with some relations to some earlier trustees, and that this would upset the claim.
And the extraordinary thing about the Act was that Section 10 specifically said, on the passing of this Act, all further proceedings in the pending action shall be virtue of this section be stayed. So they basically were trying to bring an act in to stop people bringing
and
claiming the
thankfully
money.
for our democracy, the courts objected. And the Supreme Court, I understand that the challenge was that this was an interference in the legal process by the judiciary, who didn't, or by the Oireachtas, which didn't have a right. So one of the things of the unexpected consequences was there was a reaffirmation of personal rights in terms of property.
Yeah.
Which they didn't, Sinn Féin people weren't thinking of at all, but that became the issue. And the second thing was the division of responsibility between the Oireachtas and the legal system. And the legal system were absolutely adamant, I think, as it went on, that they had no right to pass a bill in the Oireachtas, which was undermining a process which was their responsibility. And it was a constitutional crisis around this.
The extraordinary thing... Sorry.
I'm just saying, you've explained that brilliantly, Des. I mean, it
I'm
was
not a legal...
No, and that's what I'm saying. It's actually a separation of powers. You've explained it in a nutshell.
They were the two key issues.
You know, there had been a judicial process in place, and then the legislature intervened and basically brought that to an end, you know, and that was what they tried to do.
But the funny personal twist often there, my uncle, as he was sucking his pipe, said, they went through every legal process, so he didn't recognise the Free State until all the money was exhausted and they've got nothing.
Well, that's something I wanted to ask. But did Sinn Féin at the time even recognise the existence of the state?
No, they didn't.
And yet they still managed to...
This uncle of mine was one of the irredentists who didn't recognise the Free State. And they had to swallow to even go into the courts. It was very interesting, some of them. And you can imagine, I think a lot of that died off, even in Sinn Féin after. But up to then, there was this thing about the legitimacy, which I think Gerry Adams used afterwards, this thing to say, Gerry Adams claims he was never in the IRA, but he was president of Sinn Féin, and there was always this question, what were the actual links between the IRA and Sinn Féin? So the president of Sinn Féin was like the president, and you go back to the Dáil, first Dáil.
Of course.
And so he could be talking on one side of the mouth, claiming that he wasn't in the IRA, but he was the president of Sinn Féin. So
but there was this extraordinary dynamic where the Fianna Fáil government of the day instructed John A. Costello from Fine Gael and Sean McBride from Clan Republican as and former chief of staff of the IRA to represent the Fianna Fáil government in defending the claim by Sinn Féin for the old Sinn Fein funds.
That's right. It's extraordinary when you look at it. And I think it's one of these examples of the, ill-conceived consequences. Because it reaffirmed, seemed to me, when looking at the judgments at the end, it reaffirmed private property and the rights of people with private property, and it reaffirmed the separation of powers. And it put the Oireachtas back in its box.
Hugely significant. And we should tell people, like, it started off with, Sinn Fein members saying, we're entitled to this money. We're entitled, give us our money, basically. Yes. De Valera intervening, saying, you're not getting your money. We want to give the money back to other people and get control of it. He brings in this legislation, the Sinn Fein Funds Act.
That's right.
Mark has read out Section 10 there, and, that was going to put a stop to all legislation. Yes. Gavin Duffy, who was the president of the High Court, said this is unconstitutional. He was very good on it. Goes to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court overturns and tells De Valera to go away with his act.
Yes.
And then it comes back to a legendary judge of the 1940s, 1950s, maybe 1960s, Mark. You can't remember back that far, can you?
Not quite, but he did. Yeah, he went on to the Supreme Court.
So Kingsmill Moore, Mr. Justice Kingsmill Moore, great man for fishing. Great man, wrote a definitive book on fly fishing in Ireland, I think. He was still highly regarded. But he was the guy who took a firm hold of this case. Yes. And the big issue was the newly constituted Sinn Fein post the treaty, 1923, was that the same as the Sinn Fein that existed pre the treaty?
Yeah.
And that was his thinking.
And that was an interesting question, because a lot of the people who were, like Arthur Griffith and people like that, didn't even support 1916, incidentally. The old Sinn Féin you're talking about was a different kind of issue. It became known as the Sinn Féin Rise, but never was. It wouldn't have happened if Connolly hadn't have led the citizen army out with the volunteers who had broken. So whether Sinn Féin could realistically claim it was their rebellion is another question. But then when it came to the first Dáil, they all ran under the Sinn Féin banner, you see. That was the 1919.
Yes.
And so that was and the Republicans subsequently always claimed their legitimacy from the first Dáil. They didn't accept the treaty, but they reckoned their legitimacy was rooted in their links back to the first
Dáil.
And
the reality of the situation was that in terms of Sinn Féin, when the treaty came, Sinn Féin was the all-encompassing party in I suppose, the 26 counties at that stage. And the majority of Sinn Féin members backed the treaty, backed Collins,
It's not evident that you have to differentiate between the members of Sinn Féin and the IRA. The IRA didn't back it, and Cumann na mBan didn't back it. But what happened was that the constitutional nationalist element in there did back it, and the Catholic Church backed it, and so on, and the people wanted it. There's no doubt about that. You have to accept that was the democracy. But having said that, the residual, De Valera led them at the time, and the Republicans and Liam Lynch and so on, as you know, the Civil War, there was huge parts of the country which were still loyal Republicans, did not accept the treaty. So there was a continuity there. And my Uncle Jim and all those, they would claim their continuity went right back, and that they were the legitimate heirs to the national spirit and the Dáil of 1919.
What I find interesting about the judgment by Kingsmill Moore, I mean, this is a man who presumably came from a unionist background.
An interesting, intelligent man.
His judgment is it's a tour de force of following through the history of Sinn Féin with a certain, I'd say, deadpan humour. And there's a line I came across here where he says, "For the time being, however, Sinn Féin had ceased to be monarchical. It had shed its gay cavalier garb of kings, lords and commons and assumed the Puritan broadcloth of the Republic. In its new dress, it was irresistible." He's going back to Arthur Griffith's notion of the dual monarchy and saying, they're going through a kind of a temporary Republican phase.
No, actually, the only place that could nail their colours was not the early Sinn Féin, because that was Arthur Griffith and so on, who was actually a constitutional nationalist. And sort of, in fact, it's very interesting recently, just my own personal response. I was listening to a debate about John Bruton and people speaking about the role of Fine Gael and so on, how they're the constitutional nationalists and, peace-loving and so on, and that they shouldn't have been this rebellion led by Connolly and so on. But actually, they sent 200,000 people off to an English war. Like 35,000 at least died, and thousands more came back. There was only about 1,000 involved in 1960 for 6 days, and they shut down the operation when it looked like Dublin was getting bombed.
You're getting very controversial here now, Des. You're getting very controversial.
I'm doing an analysis in this late stage of what
in the end, Kingsmill Moore came down and he said, I think he, as Mark has read out there, I mean, I think he developed a great fondness for the Sinn Féin members who are claiming this money. But he basically says, I can't give it to you, lads. I can't give it to you. And the reason I can't is because the the original Sinn Fein had the funds, and you guys were reconstituted, and you're a different organisation. You might sound the same, you might look the same, you might have the same name, but you're different, and therefore I can't give you the money.
But what I don't know, what was left at that stage?
Well, it was still...
When you guys got at it.
Well, there was legal costs, but let's not talk about those.
Can I just point out one other feature that I loved about this? The only precedent that he relies on is the case of the Hurlingham Club, which was a club that was started for the purposes of pigeon shooting, and it then moved into polo and other sports. And by the majority of its members, they said they voted to favour moving into polo. And he felt that the comparison between the Hurlingham Club and Sinn Fein was the most appropriate precedent to bring into this particular judgment. But he took the view that between 1922 and 1923, the old Sinn Fein effectively came to an end, and the new Sinn Fein was a different organisation.
So the Sinn Feiners back in the 40s, or 1950, when I think this ultimately came to a conclusion, they didn't get their money. But I think Mr. Buckley, I can't think of his first name, who led the charge.
Ma Buckley, to call her, was a woman.
Ma Buckley. Ma Buckley, okay.
Yeah, she was the main trustee at the time.
Ma Buckley, okay. Well, Ma Buckley, she kind of sort of piped up in the court and said, look, she didn't seem to be too upset about this at all. And she said, wow, this has given us an opportunity to assert ourselves and to tell the world that we're still here. You know, and she saw it as a major publicity
coup. That's what I would have picked up in the House. There was a bit of a laugh about this, that they had actually put the court, they had put all the courts at the throat of Fianna Fáil. They had raised up their own presence, reasserted their claim to the Republic and so on. So that was there. And interesting enough, my father had joined the LDF to defend the country because he reckoned the Germans more of a threat than the British. And my uncle wouldn't speak to him because even though we're in the uniform of the Free State Army.
The LDF being the...
Yeah, it's interesting. But I'll just tell you another little nugget before you go. My partner, grandfather, was Charles Meredith, a very famous legal man, the chairman of the Sinn Fein courts.
Oh, yes.
Who has had all sorts of precedents in jurisprudence. And again, he was a Quaker. He came from a Quaker background, a Protestant background originally, became a Quaker. And reading up on his experience going through the period of the War of Independence, right to the League of Nations, where he represented Ireland, League of Nations, but he never got to the Supreme Court because it was all the Catholics got those positions. And he's an interesting man. He created a lot of decisions. He went back to the Brehon laws about how you deal with prisoners. He dealt with things in the Brehon laws to do with the environment. There's a whole lot of radical stuff around there.
Well, look, we are going to do the Dáil
connections.
We're going to do the Dáil courts in a later show on one of these shows later with John Biggins, an academic from UCD in Maynooth, who is an expert on this. And actually, the impact of kind of the War of Independence and all that sort of stuff in a more kind of general administrative way is now coming in because people focus on the violence, etc. But all that sort of stuff. And we're going to look at that and the courts and the role of the courts in relation to that. Des, this has been absolutely fascinating, but I normally we'd wait a little while before we get to our final question, which is to recommend a book. But I'm looking at your pile of books here that you've written. And a CD, and the book that I remember reading it at the time in 1994, actually. It was 10 years after the death of Luke Kelly. Luke Kelly was a pal, and you wrote the definitive biography of him.
Because I looked upon Luke Kelly as kind of a Jim Larkin with a banjo. Yeah. This man had actually taken up all the spirit, all the kind of vitality and the interest in working class people world over, and sang it out in the 60s. And I believe his singing was transformative in those days, and it helped and the Dubliners became one of the big factors in the transformation of modern Ireland. I mean, a lot of things flowed after that, but they were at the centre of the challenge. You remember there were bandits, Seven Drunken Nights.
Top of the Pops.
Yeah, but not only that, but they got recognition for our music in Germany and all over Europe.
And did you know Luke? Was he a pal? Was he a friend?
Yeah, and the family were very close friends as well. And even when Luke was in England, his brother was very close friend. So yeah, there was a close affinity there. When I was asked by his brother to do a little bit of talk 10 years after his death, and when I started writing, I said he deserves more than just a half an hour. He deserves a book, so I wrote that book that time. I followed that up, incidentally, with one which I'm sorry is not being read these days, called 40 Shades of Green.
Okay.
And that was about when the members of the union...
like Johnny Cash.
Yeah, but you know what it was? It was better than Johnny Cash because this was actually done when people started objecting to foreigners coming into Ireland and taking their jobs.
Right.
And I wrote a piece pointing out the role that they played in Ireland. And you see them all the big jobs, important jobs in the hospitals and so on. I wrote that book called 40, showed that these were an improvement on what we had before, and they were a big addition.
And what era was that? What year did you write that?
It's very hard for me to put dates on that, but I think it was still in the Union at that time, so it was probably in the 201, 203.
Yeah, okay, so about 20 years ago, yeah.
And that was really at the early stages. That's a book which does deal with the Civil War and Sinn Fein, and that's my uncle Jack, who was the leader of the Dublin Unemployed with Liam O'Flaherty.
Liam O'Flaherty, the writer, the short story writer.
They took over the Rotunda to object to this split and so on like that, and wanted people to focus on see that we want war. And that painting was done by, at the time, Harry Kernoff, a famous artist. So I felt that that's what I should use. And I put down "We Dare to Dream of an Island of Equals." So that's the more recent one. I just showed that the Dubliners asked me to write the notes on the Luke Kelly CD when they did it, and that's a bit more technical work, more probably appropriate to me, Clayton Lieben. I helped to drop the information in Ireland, which was one in every country in Europe on European Works Councils.
Okay.
When that came into vogue, that we needed it, and so I drew up guidelines with this man Gallagher on the whole study of how we should heckle and how it fitted into European law.
You've had an incredible career, Des. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, I have to say, and thank you for talking about your uncle's role in the famous Sinn Fein Funds case from the 1940s. It's fascinating, and it's one that we should never forget. And as you say, separation of powers, very significant constitutional decision by the Supreme Court that we all benefit from still today. What about a movie, Des? Are you into the movies at all? When I rang you there the other day, you were going to a movie.
When you asked me the question about a movie and a book, I read all the time, so picking out a particular book. So I actually felt that this book I would like to recommend is Manana Heron. It's about the women of Ireland, and it addresses most of our modern histories, most of the history we read and learn. There's very little about the women. So this was a great collection by a woman called Nicola Dupuy from Cork, curiously enough. But I just thought it was fascinating. We go back reading right up to Mary Robinson and all that, and show the effect women have had on modern Ireland.
So that's Nicola Dupuy's
Women Who Shaped Ireland.
Yeah, fantastic.
I think it's a fantastic book, and I would recommend it to anyone.
Great.
Films, I don't know. I'm involved in trying to get a film on the road for James Connolly. I've been involved on the board of RTE and TG Car. So I'm involved in films.
We'll have to
I don't know where to start on the film.
I knew that at the start. We might have gone in a different direction with this interview, but anyway.
Okay.
Come here. Thank you very much for coming in. It's been really enjoyable. Des Geraghty, thanks for being a guest on the Fifth Court.
Good morning.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
So that's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can we say a huge thank you to our guest, Des Geraghty. What a tour de force.
Yeah, I mean,
a Tour de France. It was fantastic, Mark, wasn't it?
It was very good. He's got so many stories to tell. We could have talked to him for many interviews.
Absolutely, and we did get to mention the Sinn Fein Funds case as well, didn't we? In the course of the interview, I thought that was a brilliant interview. I really enjoyed it. Before we go, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our producer Conal O'Moroyne, and also to Alison O'Dwyer for the wonderful work she did in recording this podcast this evening. So from me, Peter Leonard,
and myself, Mark Tottenham,
we'll see you soon in the Fifth Court.